In the early 2000s, real-time strategy was going through a period of unprecedented prosperity. Nothing was off limits, and every possible idea was seemingly being explored. Traditional 2D, New Age 3D, space RTSs, historical RTSs, sequels to existing series, new IPs. All you need was a budget, an idea, and hey, you can make a real-time strategy game from that. But of course, only a tiny fraction of games released in this period would make waves in the genre, and even a smaller number of developers would make real names for themselves by consistently releasing quality titles, and not just riding the coattails of a single hit all the way to the bank. And one of those developers was Relic Entertainment. Founded in 1997 in Vancouver, Canada, Relic's debut title, Homeworld, released in '99, instantly proved that they meant business, garnering massive praise and reaching sky-high sales numbers over 500,000 within its first 6 months. And unlike many developers, Relic continued to release hit after hit, to the point where they became one of the most prolific real-time strategy developers of their time. Homeworld in '99, Impossible Creatures in '03, Homeworld 2 later that same year, followed by, of course, Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War in '04. And in the years following Dawn of War and its expansions, Relic would release more hits like Company of Heroes and Dawn of War 2, among others, even venturing into genres other than RTS at times, such as with Space Marine. And while recent projects like Dawn of War 3 have left fans dissatisfied, the announcement of Relic's involvement in the upcoming Age of Empires 4 has left many excited for their prospects. But those are all subjects for other videos, for other times. The debut entry in what would become one of their flagship series, Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War, aimed to challenge the status quo of real-time strategy games of the era, bringing with it new mechanics that look to shake up the formula and provide something truly exciting. And though likely not intentional, Dawn of War would become the progenitor of almost every single one of Relic's future titles, whether they were within the series or otherwise. Dawn of War is a fast-paced, action-orientated, squad-based RTS, based in the Warhammer 40k universe, which as you'll likely know originated as a tabletop game in the late 1980s, created and managed by Games Workshop. And since then the series has been spun off, expanded into, and supplemented by other mediums, such as books, movies, and of course, video games. Starting with Gremlin Interactive's Space Crusade, the 40k IP has been licensed out for games for nearly 30 years now, along with its sister series Warhammer Fantasy. And it's seen some massively successful releases in that time, with a lot coming in just in the last 5 or 10 years. But it wasn't always this way, and it would take over a decade from its initial outing that Warhammer 40k would see its first real hit and reach a more mainstream audience with Relic's strategy masterpiece. After its initial release, Dawn of War received 3 separate expansions: Winter Assault, Dark Crusade, and Soulstorm, with the latter 2 being completely standalone. Each added new campaigns, factions, units, and more, so evaluating them all in 2020 and deciding on the best one to play isn't as straightforward as you might think. But I think I've figured out how we're going to do this thing. I'll start with general gameplay, and then we'll evaluate each release focusing on their campaigns individually, ordered by release date. Afterwards, we'll discuss the situation with Skirmish and how it differs in each version, as well as take a holistic look at all 4 entries, and decide why you should play any of them over the others. Then we'll quickly touch the modding scene, any modding considerations there may be, and the series' legacy after its release. And yeah, I know, that's a lot to cover. So strap in, grab a snack, open Astartes in another tab because you're inevitably going to go watch it after this, and let's get right into it. Dawn of War is a real-time strategy game that never lets off the gas. Often RTSs tend to start slow, gradually ramping up the intensity as the match goes on. But not here. Almost right from the word go, Dawn of War is frenetic as you aim to constantly expand across the map by capturing points and meeting your enemy in relatively small scale, but no less intense combat. Across the base game and its 3 expansions, Dawn of War features 9 factions, those being the Space Marines, the Orcs, the Eldar, the Chaos Space Marines, the Imperial Guard, the Necrons, the Tau Empire, the Sisters of Battle, and the Dark Eldar. And while each function in a similar manner, they of course have their own strengths, weaknesses, pros, cons, and unique abilities. There's also massive variation in terms of their unit roster, and they even vary mechanically between themselves depending on what game you're playing them in. Despite being an action RTS, base building is still a core component of Dawn of War, and there's 2 primary resources used to train, build, and upgrade, all in the name of slaughtering your enemies in glorious battle. What's interesting, and a key differentiator to most strategy games of the time, is that both resources are infinite. Requisition is gathered by capturing and holding the strategic points dotted around the map, similar to the system developed for Company of Heroes, and power is gathered by building generators and utilizing special deposits on the map, almost exactly like the system used in Impossible Creatures. This method of resource gathering allows the game to be laser focused on combat, because of its incentivization of pushing you to capture, hold, and take more and more resource points across the map. Like I said earlier, Dawn of War is a squad-based RTS, and its battles occur on a much smaller scale than a lot of other strategy games of the era. Most units come in groups of 2 to 4, barring vehicles and a few others, and they're most often based around ranged attacks, though that's not always the case, and everything can engage in melee combat if the situation requires it. Some even thrive off it. And you can use this to your advantage, as attacking a unit in melee will force it to answer in kind, meaning you can tie up powerful ranged units who may be far weaker in a melee. All your infantry can be upgraded with a variety of things like more squad members, special weapons, squad leaders, and more. Take your standard Space Marine team for example. Straight out of training they come with their standard issue bolters, but can be upgraded with any assortment of flamers, heavy bolters, missile launchers, or plasma guns. The same goes for vehicles, of which there are a generous bunch for each faction. Space Marine Predator tanks can have their bolter cannons upgraded to anti-vehicle lasers for instance, but even though the game offers it, you need to think about what you're going to be engaging, because if you're implementing those lasers, you're going to be limiting your anti-infantry capabilities of that vehicle. A good compromise might just be to upgrade your autocannon to combat enemy vehicles, and leave your 2 heavy bolter sponsons on the side to mop up the infantry. Along with your foot soldiers and vehicles, you can also train powerful single units that can go it alone or be attached to existing squads. The Space Marine's Apothecary, for example, is a heavy infantry trooper that will increase the rate of which its squad regenerates health, and it also doesn't count against your squad capacity, so there's no reason to use them wherever you can. More powerful examples can be found in Commanders, of which each faction has a small handful to choose from. They can range from spellcasters to frontline combat meat cleavers to specialist assassins. They come with their own abilities and their own strengths and weaknesses of course, and provide bonuses when attached to infantry teams, such as passively increasing their combat effectiveness or boosting their morale. The latter of which is displayed in this little blue bar here. If it empties, the unit will break, and it will be far less effective in battle until they can rally again. But don't worry, they won't leave the battlefield or anything like in a Total War game. Morale is affected by many things, one of which is the unit's state of cover. Yes, you may not have realised it, but Dawn of War does feature a fairly simple cover system, though it's more of a passive mechanic here based on the terrain the unit is standing on, rather than an active one like Relic would go on to develop for Company of Heroes. Light or heavy cover has positive effects, while negative cover will make your units take more damage and move slower. It should also be noted that cover works differently for certain types of units and factions, so it's not a one-size-fits-all system. Necron units, for example, aren't affected by cover at all, and melee units that have jump packs like the Chaos Raptor squads won't be afflicted by a movement penalty. The range of upgrade options across vehicles and infantry give you a lot to manage and think about, as you're constantly weighing up which of them is going to best suit your current situation. And it's a great way to get you invested in the individual units you are leading into battle, because you're doing it on a squad by squad basis. You could have 3 teams of Space Marines, all with unique commanders and heavy weapon loadouts, each with a specific role to fill in combat. And they're roles you're going to need to fill, because combat in Dawn of War isn't as simple as throwing hordes of orc boys at your enemy until they've been reintegrated with the soil, though they will definitely try their hardest to do so. No, here it's about bringing the right tools for the job, the right weapons for the right enemy, because while anything will of course chip away the health of any encroaching target, there's more than enough damage modifiers to make you think about your approach. That army of lowly orc boys coming at you from over the hill, mow them down brutally and effectively with heavy bolter equipped Space Marines before they can get close. But of course you're almost never going to meet an enemy who's slinging just one type of unit, so it's a constant balancing act of playing to your strengths and exploiting your foe's weaknesses. Dawn of War's combat is deep, tactical, and comes with a ton of player agency in terms of how you want to run your forces and utilise their many abilities. Knowing you put in the early investment to have it pay off in the long run in regards to equipping and trading your squads is an exciting, satisfying loop that makes me enjoy Dawn of War's moment-to-moment gameplay more than a lot of other RTSs. Because you can't instantly just replenish your forces with troops just as powerful, as it takes valuable time and resources to do so. Engagements and each subsequent meter of ground you take have a lot more weight to them, and everything feels like you earned it. Nothing comes free or easy in Dawn of War. Some things do take a bit of work though, and like most RTSs of the day, pathfinding can be a real issue, and it stood out to me across all of the game's campaigns. It's not the worst I've seen by any stretch, but trying to move a column of rhinos and Space Marines through a fairly thin passageway like this can get irritating. There are also some issues that you might run into with units shooting through walls, or firing at units on terrain that should really be out of reach. Nothing game breaking, but it does stand out. Luckily, the visuals are there to keep you entertained, and watching it all unfold is incredibly gratifying due to the impressive effects on display, especially when considering the game's age. Things like machine gun fire and explosions in particular make Dawn of War stand out from the crowd, and even today the weight of it is really eye-catching. Plus the liberal splattering of blood thrown into the mix really emphasises the brutality of the combat that you're taking part in. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the sync kills either, gloriously detailed, hand-animated actions that give melee fights a dynamic element that's hard to take your eyes off of. All of this is backed up by an excellent soundtrack, great voice acting, and incredibly sharp sound effects that all combine to make a game that, despite being 16 years old, remains quite the audio-visual package. A welcome feature returning from earlier Relic games is the ability to visually customize your army via the in-game painter. It's available in all of Dawn of War's versions, and it offers some pretty in-depth visual options. You can create any number of visual styles, ranging from my tactical Space Marines here, all the way up to my Bright Boys here. It's a fun inclusion, and it's something I'd like to see in more RTSs, though I get why Relic didn't bring it along to Company of Heroes, as that could have led to some inaccuracies. Now, it's time to move on to the campaigns. We're going to be running through all of them, so please refer to the timecodes on screen or in the description if you want to skip ahead to get to a particular one. Dawn of War follows Captain Gabriel Angelos and his third company of the Blood Ravens, a chapter of Space Marines serving the Imperium of Man. The 11-mission campaign has Gabriel and his Marines as its centre focus while you fight your way through all manner of Orcs, Eldar and Chaos forces. It's presented like many RTSs of the day were, through dialogue and in-game cutscenes that are charmingly out of date in 2020. We open with a simple goal: quell a green tide of Orcs as they threaten the planet Tartarus. These first few handful of missions reflect the bare-bones introduction to the story, and they act as a tutorial in a way, restricting the buildings and units available to you and slowly introducing fresh mechanics to show you the ropes. It does an effective job of introducing us to our main characters too. Captain Angelus and the Bloodraven librarian Isidore are immediately likable and display a clear bond as soon as they share scenes. And despite looking very 2004, they are modelled convincingly and voice acted exceptionally, which you'll find isn't out of the ordinary in these campaigns.
It is written in the Codex Astartes that this situation calls for a defensive action.
Of course. You are right. Perhaps patience is the better virtue here.
After stomping some dirty knobs, this is what they're called. For a few hours and 4 missions, in number 5 we're introduced to the Eldar. And it's here the campaign gets slightly more complex, as we now have 3 conflicting factions on the field, as well as a few more secondary objectives and interesting map designs. Unfortunately, the design of the campaign itself doesn't really evolve past this, and from here on out until the end of the final mission, it's purely fighting from one side of the map to the other, until you've reached an objective or wiped out all enemies in the vicinity. It's a shame the mission design is so lackluster, because I know Relic had the capability to make more dynamic RTS campaigns. Heck, they even proved that with Impossible Creatures, released 1 year prior. Staged missions, unique objectives, and obviously the whole collect creature DNA thing managed to keep that game's gameplay consistently fresh, while also providing an interesting story with some awesome characters. I would have liked to have seen something more in line with that here. Luckily, Dawn of War is about the action, and the action is exciting enough to keep it entertaining. And even though you can only ever play as the Space Marines here, using their variety of weapons and tools at their disposal to rip through Orcs, Eldar and Chaos Marines did keep me engaged for the majority. Speaking of Chaos, they're introduced around a third of the way through the campaign in the form of the Alpha Legion, a name you've likely heard before. For those unfamiliar, they're one of the original 18 legions of Space Marines formed in their first founding, and subsequently one of the 9 traitor legions who fought against the Emperor of Man in the Horus Heresy. See, I've done my homework, don't go into the comments and say I didn't try, alright? And it's when the Alpha Legion arrives that the narrative starts to do a lot of the heavy lifting in the campaign. The characters are so well acted that you're always itching to get to the next cutscene, and it can help trudging through the repetitive nature of the missions, if the gameplay isn't really doing it for you. The Chaos leaders, Lord Bale and Finlay, bring a villainous charm to the faction, and it's not long before their intentions on the planet become clear. It turns out there's a hidden Chaos artifact on Tartarus called the Maledictum that's influencing the planet's inhabitants with whispers of Chaos corruption, and they're after it. Scrambling, the Blood Ravens try to find the artifact before the Alpha Legion, and before it's all too late. But alas, the enemy do get to it first, and the story, among other things, becomes one of betrayal. First with Sindri, who turns on Lord Bale in order to claim the artifact for himself, and secondly with your loyal brother Isidore, who ultimately succumbs to Chaos corruption from Sindri and the artifact itself. In the end, you're forced to fight and execute him, and then kill the sorcerer who uses the Maledictum to become a demon prince himself. And with that, victory. Or so it would seem. It turns out the Maledictum holds a powerful demon inside that just needs a few blood sacrifices for it to start ripping and tearing on the mortal plane, which you have unwittingly provided through hours of slaughtering Orcs and Eldar, and losing countless men in the process. It also doesn't help that Gabriel splits it in half in order to stop its corruption of the planet, despite the warnings from the Eldar who trapped it there in the first place. The greater of two evils, I guess. The game ends with the demon thanking you for releasing it, and shows its appreciation by leaving you in peace, for the time being. It does promise it will indeed return one day and kill you last. Way to end on a high note, guys. Overall, the story is engaging, it's enjoyable, and it has a few fun twists and turns, some of which are more predictable than others, to be fair. It's mainly held up by its excellent character performances, which manage to shine through despite the shortcomings of early 2000s RTS in-game cutscenes. The one thing I wish the campaign did do, however, is give more of a backstory to its characters, and especially to the Blood Ravens chapter itself. I love to get some more solid lore on their history, their Primarch, whether they were always loyal to the Emperor, their achievements, all that good stuff. And I know that there's a ton more lore given in further games and supporting material, and some of those questions have surely been answered or hinted at. but still, I would have liked to see more of it in the base game. Either way, it's possible that swamping the game with expansive exposition would have muddled the waters of the story that they were wanting to tell, and you can only do so much in a campaign that's this long, by my count around 7 to 12 hours. Even without that, it smoothly fits into the established lore and universe of Warhammer 40k, and I think Relic did an excellent job in creating a fairly condensed tale into a world with so much pre-existing information and material that you could spend a lifetime reading it and still not get through all of it. Seriously, in preparation for this video, I've listened to what must be at least 20 or 30 hours of 40k lore videos, read hundreds of pages worth of wiki articles, and I still don't feel like I've really scratched the surface. Anyway, it's a great campaign, and it's still worth it for the entertaining story and presentation alone, despite only being able to play as a single faction. And while the mission design is a bit uninspiring, the whole package easily holds up if you're thinking of playing through it today. Just maybe consider turning up the difficulty to hard if you're wanting more of a challenge. I've found normal to be pretty stress-free, with the latter difficulties feeling a little bit more even. Okay, next up, Winter Assault. Almost 1 year later to the day after Dawn of War, the game's first expansion pack, Dawn of War Winter Assault, was released. With it came a new playable faction, the Imperial Guard, another group of humans who aren't quite as boss as the Space Marines, but they do make up for it with an immense array of heavy armor and Wolverine claws. There are also new units for existing factions, quite a few updates to old units, a fancy new weather system, and obviously the headlining feature, a new campaign. It's worth noting too that unlike its successors, Winter Assault is not a standalone title, and it does require the base game to play. Changing things up from before, this campaign is split into two halves, one for Order and one for Disorder. You'll swap between two factions throughout each campaign, those being the Imperial Guard and Eldar for the former, and the Orcs and Chaos for the latter. No continuation of the Blood Ravens story here unfortunately, as it's set on an entirely different planet, though the Space Marines of the Ultramarines chapter do make some appearances. The story follows each faction as they attempt to recover the remains of an Imperial Imperator class Titan, an enormous ancient walking fortress that would strike the unflinching wrath of the Emperor into any foe who would stand in its way. Each campaign has 5 missions, with the final one being your choice of taking one of the 2 races to victory. A downside of that is that combined with the campaign's insistence of swapping between multiple factions, Winter Assault can at times feel somewhat messy and disjointed. Chaotic might be a good word for it. It at least makes sense thematically, as this really is just an immense cage match between 4 warring factions, but gameplay wise it's certainly a lot, and at times I found it to be a bit overwhelming. One other thing Winter Assault's campaign provides are massive maps with long form missions, giving a great sense of scale to its enormous battles. There's often fighting going on as far as the eye can see, and it's a nice change of pace to the original campaign's smaller battlefields and fewer overall units. The story of Order and Disorder run in parallel, so whoever you choose to play as will come out victorious by the end, making for 4 possible endings, though as far as the canon is concerned, its true outcome is actually a mix of the Eldar and Orc conclusions. The story is not half bad, and the Disorder campaign did elevate it quite a bit for me. For the Order campaign, the Imperial Guard in my opinion are just a bit of an uninteresting faction led by uninteresting people, at least in this game, and they're surpassed by the way cooler humans of the Space Marines from the original. And for some reason, I've just never really cared for the Eldar. Personal preference, I guess. Gorguts and his Orcs though, now that's a group I want to follow. This is his first introduction to the series, and apparently it's not just me who liked him, because he continues to feature in both expansions after this one, and even returned for Dawn of War 3 in 2017. Now that's a guy you really can't keep down. The Chaos guys are cool too, especially their leader, Krull, mainly because of the terrific job done by the voice actor playing him. It's over the top, absolutely insane, and I'm all here for it.
Yes! Finally some sport! Eliminating Gorguts will send the Orcs reeling! But tell everyone that I alone will claim his head! By nightfall, we'll drink a toast from his skull!
While Krull is indeed cool, it's way better seeing my main man Gorguts take his rightful victory over the Chaos boys. and the others in the final mission. I've got a lot of respect for Gorguts and his Wa too. He's really not even interested in the Titan, or trying to recover it. He just cares about stomping it to scrap because it will piss off Cruel, making his goal of putting his head on a stick a little bit easier. He's there to party, and that's something I can get behind. And by party, I mean an orc party. Like this. The story's twist, which crescendos on all of the final missions, is that the planet we're on is actually a Necron tomb world, foreshadowing their involvement in Dark Crusade. While obviously bad news for everyone involved, they are indeed defeated in both campaigns of Order and Disorder. So it's not until Dark Crusade that they prove a significant threat. Like I said, I like the story, I love Gorguts, and the gameplay is mostly unchanged from the original. So on those merits alone, Winter Assault holds up quite well. My only real gripe is that I think having 2 factions per campaign could have been done better, considering there's only 5 missions in each. Well, 6 if you count the 2 versions of the finale. The game has you swapping between your 2 factions basically every mission, sometimes mid-mission, and personally I'd rather just stay with a single one to get more acquainted to them and more comfortable gameplay wise, and it would help to get more emotionally attached to their goals too. To me, I felt like I was an outside observer, seeing all perspectives on a single conflict, rather than being part of the faction I was playing, and as such it made it difficult to root for any single group in particular. But despite that, Winter Assault's campaign is enjoyable, it's challenging, and overall, it's just a really good time because of Dawn of War's inherently satisfying gameplay loops, which are fully intact here from the original. It brought welcome additions in the new faction, units, and campaign, and proved to be an excellent follow-up for the game players had fell in love with, and simply wanted more of. But perhaps you were one of those players and you thought to yourself, this is good, but it's not enough. I want more. Well, if that's the case, then Relic heard you, because 1 year later, they would provide just that. The release of Dark Crusade represented a significant change for Dawn of War. To start with, it was a completely standalone title, so you didn't need to own the base game to play it, though you would need to input CD keys from the original and Winter Assault if you wanted to play those games' factions in multiplayer. Speaking of factions, Dark Crusade brought 2 new ones to the fray, the Necrons and the Tau Empire. The former is my favourite faction across all the games, as A, their design is just so sick, B, they're very strong in Dark Crusade, and C, the lore behind them is pretty intriguing. Not to be overshadowed, the Tau bring a ton of advanced technology and slick battlesuits, and they're a force to be reckoned with, despite their relative infancy in terms of being on the galactic stage. The biggest change Dark Crusade brought to the table was its campaign, which took the idea of a linear narrative story and said, actually, no, we don't like that anymore. But this, yes, we like this. It's set on the world of Cronus, and there are some returning characters like Gorguts, and also feature the return of the Blood Ravens after their absence from Winter Assault. Unfortunately though, our boy Gabriel Angelos is nowhere to be seen. For now. A change I really appreciate in Dark Crusade's campaign is being able to play as any of the game's factions, instead of having that choice being left out of your hands. And while narratively it suffers because of it, gameplay benefits hugely. Once you've chosen a faction with its associated leader, you're placed onto a metamap in the style of Risk, or sort of like Total War. It's also a nice nod to the origins of Warhammer 40k. No matter who you choose, the game starts with a cinematic to outline just what's going on here. Long story short, all the game's races have converged on Cronus for their own reasons, and it's up to you to crush the opposing 6 and lead your chosen faction to glory. And from that you're really just released out into the wild without much direction at all. There are tutorial pop-ups to give you a hand, but your objectives don't diverge from simply conquer the planet in its entirety. For better or worse, the turn-based overworld is mechanically simple, and it won't take you long to figure out what it is you're meant to be doing, despite how many tutorial pop-ups there may be. And while it may share similarities to something like Total War on the surface, in reality there are far fewer things to worry about than you would find in that series. Every faction has a stronghold on one of the planet's many regions, and if said region is lost to an enemy, it's game over for that faction, though their forces will still linger in regions they owned previously. Each leader is represented on the map by their little characters, and moving them is the only way to lead an offensive. So, unlike games like Total War, there's only ever one army per faction in play. To capture a region, you need to use your leader to attack it from an adjacent one. Unless you control the spaceport, that is, which allows for more free-form movement across the map. Enemy power in said region is indicated by this number here, and it's also determined by whether their commander is currently stationed there. An attack, for the most part, plays out like a regular skirmish match. There may be some unique properties, such as enemies having an established force from the moment you arrive, or featuring multiple computer players rather than just one. These matches are fun, and the inherent enjoyment of Dawn of War's combat is still at their core, but they do start to get quite repetitive as the campaign goes on. They're not really dynamic in any way, and always start you out from scratch with just your leader and your headquarters, with the objective of destroying your enemy. There's no weight or significance to these matches either, because each functions almost exactly the same, and it doesn't do a good job in connecting this battle, or any of the battles, to the overworld. I'll draw a comparison to XCOM 2, as the concept is the same, launching a small-scale battle from a large-scale overworld. But in XCOM it connects these two elements. You see your troops gearing up, boarding a shuttle, travelling to the location, and setting up on arrival. It connects you to the experience, and suddenly you're a lot more emotionally invested in the situation. Dark Crusade doesn't have any of that. You select your region, click attack, and appear on a map. Even just showing your leader arrive via dropship or walking out of a recently constructed HQ would do wonders for connecting the campaign's two elements. And to go back to Impossible Creatures again, Relic knows how to do this, as in that game's campaign it always showed your lab travelling to a new location and setting up shop, as well as having Rex and Lucy walk out of it or otherwise arrive. It's far more effective to show it rather than just teleporting you to a new location after a pre-mission text screen said you'd done so. I can best describe most of Dark Crusade's campaign as skirmish matches tied together by an extremely loose narrative. But I said most of it. That doesn't count the stronghold missions. Assaults on enemy strongholds represent the closest thing to a traditional Dawn of War campaign, in that there's cutscenes, voice acting, narrative elements, and unique objectives. There's one for each faction, so these make up the story portion of Dark Crusade's campaign. While they are more engaging than regular missions, unfortunately there is still not a ton of personality to them, as the game must account for you being any one of 6 races. The actual story cutscenes are always the same no matter who you're playing, which takes away some of the potential impact of the story. It would be much more effective, though likely unfeasible for the time, to have individual scenarios for every possible variation of the stronghold assaults. Though to its credit there are unique voice lines for all the leaders which are faction dependent, so that is something. Luckily, the stronghold missions do have unique objectives along with their own main and side goals, and overall are significantly more difficult than your standard mission. Enemies will start coming at you from almost the moment you arrive, so it's a tooth and nail fight right up until the end, which does a great job at keeping you on your toes. Hearing all that, you might be thinking that sounds a bit dull for a campaign stretched over 10 to 20 hours. But thankfully Dark Crusade does have some tricks up its sleeve in order to diversify its formula of what is essentially just a bunch of skirmish games tied together by a loose plot and overworld map. The first is your leader, who can be upgraded with unique items gained by claiming victory in battles throughout the game. These give bonuses while providing cosmetic differences too, and overall adds a strong sense of progression for the campaign. You can also equip your leader with Honor Guard by spending a requisition gained by capturing regions. These units are present with your leader at the start of the game and can help to give you a bit of a head start as they can capture points and fend off any initial hostile attacks. They persist until death too, so if you can keep them alive, they'll constantly follow your leader into battle. That is until they meet an unruly war boss who's a bit too much to handle. Another intricacy is that any bases built in your attacks on other regions will persist once you've returned to the overworld, meaning if that region is later attacked, you won't be starting with nothing. You will need to start again with research and technology, but all of your existing base defences and buildings will be right where you left them. You can also garrison a certain number of units there too, again by paying requisition in the overworld map. Complete victory for the campaign is achieved once all strongholds have been captured, and thankfully there is a unique ending for each faction to wrap up the story and explain its subsequent effects on the universe. even though canonically speaking it is the Space Marines who come out on top. I mean, it couldn't be anyone else. Compared to the first two games, Dark Crusade's campaign is a significant departure to what players had already experienced and praised, and it was undoubtedly a difficult decision for Relic to make and go in the direction that they did. But it paid off, and today it's often considered to be the best of the series. In fact, nearly 50% of people I asked in this poll thought the same. Remember this, we'll come back to it later. Even now, it's satisfying to carve your way across Kronos as your favourite faction, annihilating your enemies and empowering your leader to become an unstoppable killing machine along the way. And when compared to games of the era that had much deeper overworld systems, like Empire Total War and even Star Wars Empire at War, Dark Crusade managed, and today still manages, to provide a unique experience that's held up by its thrilling, engaging, and utterly brutal squad-based combat. Right, last on the list. While many hold the opinion that it's the worst in the series, there are others that hold it up as quite the opposite. Yes, it is time for Soulstorm. The last of the Dawn of War expansions, Soulstorm, was released in 2008, again as a standalone title. However, the twist is that unlike its predecessors, this was not developed by Relic, but by Relic Entertainment, creators of the fantastical hack and slash and pretty good Titan Quest, among others. Relic had of course been swept up by Company of Heroes by this point, and as such likely didn't have the time to create yet another expansion for Dawn of War. But alas, THQ was obviously itching for one, so Relic were put to work on it instead. Soulstorm follows a similar model to Dark Crusade, and the fact that it added 2 new factions, a new unit for all the existing ones, and a fresh campaign in a similar style, with the same format of a loose narrative tied together through player-driven skirmish matches and movements in its overworld. While functionally similar, Relic did make some changes to Dark Crusade's formula, though it's likely nothing that will change your fundamental opinion on that game's campaign. The most significant are of course the 2 new races, the Sisters of Battle and the Dark Eldar. The former is an all-female division of the Imperium's church, the Ecclesiarchy, who really love fire and its cleansing properties, especially when it's used to scorch heretics and burn out corruption across the Empire. The latter, the Dark Eldar, are a sadistic, super-intelligent and technologically advanced race of edgelords who only find satisfaction in horrifically sadistic practices like enslavement, torture, and browsing on 4chan. Another notable addition brought by Soulstorm were faction-specific abilities, which further diversified the game's 9 races beyond their inherent differences. Some are more significant than others, with things like being able to invest in advanced bases using requisition for the Sisters of Battle on one end of the spectrum, and the Eldar's increased movement speed on the other. These aren't just tied to the faction either, they're attached to the stronghold of each of them, so as you progress throughout the game, capturing an enemy stronghold will grant you that faction's specific ability to go along with your own, and any others you may have. I'm for the addition of these abilities as it gives factions another differentiator from each other, and more unique mechanics for the campaign are always welcome, as without them it's really just a bunch of skirmish games tied together with the notable stronghold and special missions. I just wish they were all as significant as each other, as some feel far more impactful in the grand scheme of things, and some are just a complete waste of time. While I don't think anyone is going to be balking at new factions or abilities, the other major changes that came with Soulstorm are more contentious. The first is persistent bases, or rather the lack thereof. Nothing you build sticks around after victory like it did in Dark Crusade. Instead, if that region is attacked, you start completely fresh. On the one hand, this change does address the cheesing you could do in Dark Crusade, where you build turrets around all the map's listening post and reinforce as much as you can, so when the enemy arrives you have a significant advantage. But on the other hand, it makes defending your regions a huge pain and potentially helps in making the campaign drag on, and on, and on. There's also the addition of air units. While on paper it seems like a good idea, in practice I feel confident in saying it's a net negative in terms of gameplay. You can just tell that the engine is not made to accommodate them, and while I'm no game developer, I'd say there was a good amount of spaghetti code required to get these things working. And that's if you consider them to be working at all. Throughout my time I experienced a multitude of issues, like not being able to move them across terrain where an air unit should be able to move, and they would just stay still and not do anything, and having animations just completely forget that these units are, in the sky. The final major issue I have with Soulstorm is not a specific one, but more of a culmination of things. It feels bloated and overcomplicated for no real reason. Like the developers looked at Dark Crusade and said, we need more! More planets in the campaign, visually a mess and far too confusing for its own good. Abilities that range from game-changing to insignificant. A new class of unit that in my opinion degrades the overall quality of the combat. Soulstorm is also just a drag to play at times. Since the campaign map is bigger and bases aren't persistent, games can go on for ages. And often I found the campaign to be a constant uphill battle of defending regions and building bases over and over again. To me, Soulstorm feels like an unnecessary expansion, and that's coming from someone who doesn't even hold any bias against the game, which apparently launched in an atrocious state and contained bugs that would completely break the campaign, which weren't fixed for months. Luckily, however, the core of what makes Dawn of War so excellent is still intact, so there's still fun to be had with Soulstorm. Plus the new factions do add meaningful gameplay changes to keep it fresh, at least for a while. But the good thing about looking back at the entire collection is that you could choose what version is best for you. There's no need to force yourself into a release you didn't like. So with that in mind, let's see which is really the best, looking back through a modern lens, shall we? Choosing which version of Dawn of War to play in 2020 is an interesting endeavour, because of the myriad of options available on how to do so. It's easy if you're just looking to go through the campaigns, as they all genuinely offer something the others don't. The original for a linear story campaign, Winter Assault for a story campaign seen from multiple factions on different sides, Dark Crusade's concise and fun conquest mode as any faction, and Soulstorm for more of an endurance slugging match with the biggest variety of factions and units. But what's the best campaign? Well, that depends on who you ask. For me, I think Dark Crusade takes the cake, followed by the original, closely by Winter Assault after that, and then Soulstorm. Dark Crusade is well executed and provides something significantly different to what came before it, and it's not overly complicated like I found Soulstorm to be. Simple, effective, and a heck of a lot of fun. And as for the original, I have a bit of a bias towards old school charming RTS campaigns, and Dawn of War is executed really well and doesn't overstay its welcome. I think it really is the perfect length. If I had to rank my top 3 RTS campaigns of all time, I think it would be Impossible Creatures, the original Stronghold, and maybe this. It really is just that good. As for Winter Assault, I did enjoy the faction variety and the dual perspectives, but often found it just a bit much, and I'd prefer just to stick with the one faction per side. The story and characters were pretty compelling, especially Gorguts, but as for the Imperial Guard edition, they just didn't really do much for me, and the difficulty of the later missions put a bit of a dampener on my desire to complete it. Still, it did beat out Soulstorm for me, which I found too complicated and way too lengthy for its own good, without enough meaningful upgrades of a Dawn of War that were in the right direction. And the E units really do suck. Funnily enough, that seems to be your guys' consensus too, with the answers to my poll showing similar results. Dark Crusade way in the lead, followed by the original, Winter Assault, and then Soulstorm. And for skirmisher multiplayer, it's up to you. Again, Dark Crusade is the most beloved retrospectively, but Soulstorm has the most content, and it's the preferred modding platform. But faction balance differs between releases too, so there may be some personal bias involved there. As for me, I'd go Soulstorm with its 9 factions and most varied unit and ability set, but at this point we should bring in the other, potentially superior options, likely the ones a lot of you are playing today. Which are of course the mods. Now there are more than a few community mods made for all of Dawn of War's releases, but I want to take a quick look at the most prominent, which is undoubtedly Ultimate Apocalypse for Soulstorm. There are others, such as Titanium Wars for Dark Crusade, Firestorm over Karava for Soulstorm, and all the flavours of Dawn of War Pro. But going through all those and their contemporaries would extend this video to lengths never before seen by mere mortals, so we'll stick to the one for now. There's a reason Ultimate Apocalypse is so well regarded in the community. its sheer amount of new content as well as the quality of that content is second to none. And incredibly, it's still being updated to this day, with the last release being July of this year. That's honestly incredible. Seeing something like this still being actively worked on is not a common occurrence, and along with the fact that the team behind UA have plans far into the future, it's not hard to imagine why it's collected such a fan base. As for the features, there's new factions, units, new unit classes like the Titan, which are just awesome by the way, new buildings and abilities, the list goes on. While it can be hectic and occasionally delve into the realms of insanity, when you're nuking your opponent and slinging towering mechanical nightmares at them, Ultimate Apocalypse is not here to mess around, it does mean business. And if you're looking to play Dawn of War today, there's a good argument to be made about making Ultimate Apocalypse your first, and maybe only, port of call. Luckily, no matter what version of Dawn of War you're playing, modded or otherwise, everything runs without a hitch on modern PCs, as you'd expect for a game that originally released the same year as Spider-Man 2 came out. Everything can be bought through Steam, piecemeal or as a collection, and it's $40 for the whole set. Luckily, it's often on sale if that's a bit steep. It all boots and runs without needing any pesky third-party plugins or INI edits either, always nice. Although the base game and Winter Assault are indeed locked to a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is somewhat irritating. As far as I know, there's no real fix for that, but it's not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things, despite being kind of annoying. One thing you can fix, however, is the camera's zoom range, which by default is extremely close in on large, modern, high-resolution monitors. There's a simple mod to extend that, which I've been using throughout this video. It's easy to install and it works for the whole collection, so I'd recommend you grab that. Online multiplayer is intact through Steamworks too, which is great to see, though I believe you can only play with others also on Steam, and boxed copies won't work today unless you're playing a LAN game using a service like Game Ranger or Hamachi. So all in all, Dawn of War is in a pretty good state for 2020. But it's not perfect, and you know what this series really deserves? A full stack remaster, top to bottom. Taking the base game plus all the expansions and packaging them up into a single title, fully intact campaigns, rule sets and multiplayer support. And fancy visuals, of course. Think Warcraft 3 Remastered, but without the corporate greed and taste of rat poison in your mouth. Here's what I envision. Dawn of War Ultimate Edition. Available on Steam for $30. All the campaigns united together in one game with remastered graphics and audio. Skirmish, where as part of the options you can choose your game rule set among everything else. You could choose to play with original Dawn of War rules, with only the original 4 factions, and have their stats and abilities be completely intact as they were. Chaos Space Marines with flamers and missile launchers again, yes please. Or choose the Dark Crusade rule set, because you love feeling like an overpowered monster as the Necrons. And of course there would be full multiplayer support across Skirmish, and while we're at it, we could even chuck in a co-op implementation of Dark Crusade and Soulstorm's campaigns, a la Total War. There you go Relic, that idea's on the house. Revitalise the Dawn of War series, and get rid of that uneasy feeling people get nowadays when remembering Dawn of War 3. And, bring home buckets of cash in the process. Go on, take your time, and do it right. We'll be waiting. While I'm sure it wasn't planned at the time, Dawn of War's legacy is one that has persisted long after its initial release, and it would go on to influence every single one of Relic's future titles. The most obvious is Company of Heroes, a series which would likely now be considered Relic's best and their most iconic. The titular first game was released just 1 month before Dark Crusade in September of 2006, and many mechanics and gameplay systems can trace their origins right back to the original Dawn of War, such as the squad-based combat, the unit upgrades and modifications, significant unit hard counters, and have resource gathering be based around capturing and holding points across the map. While Relic had already become a household name through Homeworld and Dawn of War and Impossible Creatures, Company of Heroes cemented them as one of the premier RTS developers of the mid-2000s. It resonated with players not only because of its unique setting for an RTS, but also because of its perfectly executed mechanics, nearly all of which had been learned from Dawn of War. Company of Heroes took what made Dawn of War great and leaned into its successes even more, with gameplay further focusing on action, and less on established RTS tropes such as resource gathering, base building, and elaborate tech trees, the latter of which Dawn of War did still hold on to. This continued with Dawn of War 2 in 2009, which saw a further move into the action space and became less of an RTS and more of some sort of real-time action strategy tactical role-playing game. And while it was well regarded, as was the sequel to Company of Heroes a few years later, most agree Relic lost their way with Dawn of War 3, by far their worst received title and the bottom of the barrel in terms of Dawn of War games. My point here is that the success of the original Dawn of War made Relic what they are today, and no doubt helped to create many subsequent RTSs by different developers in the years after. Would World in Conflict or Star Wars Empire at War exist in a world where Dawn of War did not? It's an interesting question, and it's one that Relic has surely pondered on themselves in terms of their own catalogue. While Dawn of War's success took them to heights many developers could only dream of, it's also hindered them in recent years, in their quest to develop the series into something new and fresh. Something that reminds players of the past, and has more than a passing resemblance to the series' origins, but simultaneously delivers innovative and exciting options to reinvigorate their love of the series. And if Relic does indeed want to take another crack at the series after the swath of negative feedback and the subsequent abandonment of Dawn of War 3 to the chagrin of its player base, they're going to need something truly special to reach the heights of years prior. It's not just RTSs that Dawn of War influenced either, it also helped bring Warhammer 40k to a new audience. Before 2004, there hadn't been really that many 40k games, let alone many good ones. From the years following its release, that's 2005 to today, the rate of 40k games being released has only increased. And while that could be attributed to the increase of video games' popularity in general, it's an intriguing stat nonetheless. But despite that, no one's ever really tried to cash in on the success of Dawn of War specifically. There have been other 40k strategy games, such as Battlefleet Gothic Armada and Regicide, but nothing real-time strategy, even though Relic so convincingly proved it was the perfect format for Warhammer 40k. Perhaps it's because Dawn of War was so good, so beloved, so iconic, that anything less than an improvement on that formula would be seen as an imposter, or a cheap clone of the real thing. I hope that's not the case, because I'd love to see other developers take a crack at it in the future. Looking back, it's easy to see why the Dawn of War series is as beloved as it is. As someone peering in from the outside who hadn't had much experience, I didn't quite get it. But after living and breathing the series for the past 6 or 8 weeks or so, now I certainly do. The gameplay is what stands out the most to me, though the visuals, audio and presentation is definitely nothing to sneeze at either. Despite being evolved upon and mechanically surpassed by Company of Heroes, what's available in Dawn of War is quite unlike almost any RTS out there. The small-scale, squad-based nature of it, combined with an absolute laser focus on brutal combat, backed up by intense sound and visual effects, it's a recipe for pure RTS bliss. It's all go, all the time, and I love it. And the fact that there's so many avenues to experience it, whether that be the linear story campaign of the original, the player-driven wide-open map of Dark Crusade's campaign, or just skirmish against the AI in whichever of the game's flavours you prefer, is the icing on this delicious, blood-soaked cake. Ugh, gross. Dawn of War was not just an incredible game. It was also one that had massive influence in the development of other RTSs in the years following, and at the same time brought Warhammer 40k to a more mainstream position that set the stage for a laundry list of excellent titles to be developed using the IP. It's likely that without Dawn of War, all these games wouldn't exist, or at least not in the form we know them today. As a series that originated in 2004, the leagues Dawn of War has in 2020 are impressive. And if you haven't gathered by now, it's absolutely still worth playing today, despite any shortcomings I discussed earlier. And that in of itself is a testament to Relic's prowess at creating real-time strategy games. While their earlier titles like Homeworld and Impossible Creatures were undoubtedly a success for the company, Dawn of War absolutely proved Relic was here to stay, and it unequivocally demonstrated that they weren't happy with following the status quo of the genre. They aimed to push forward with unique mechanics and settings, while also telling meaningful stories and having each game they released feel wholly unique. And while Relic haven't had a comparably successful hit for nearly a decade now, I'm hopeful they can take a look back to what got them here in the first place, and channel some of that earlier renown into a new game, one that will sweep the real-time strategy community off its feet once more. Thanks for watching. If you made it to the end, congratulations. This is the longest video I've ever made by far, and I appreciate your patience over the last wee while I worked on it. If you'd like to follow me for updates on my progress on videos like this and the channel going forward, then you can do so on Twitter. I also occasionally stream on Twitch and upload the odd video to my second channel, so I'll see you over there if you're interested. As for the main channel, the rest of the year will likely be made up of shorter videos, with my next big project being my retrospective look at the entirety of the Red Alert series. Anyways, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Say the line, Bart!
Metal boxes!
Yeah!